to what's now become the annual MERN Forum, hosted by our division. And I want to thank Heather, Dr. Hunter, for her tenacity and her commitment and gentle prodding to keep us involved and keep us engaged in the MERN process. So she does an excellent job at bringing us together and bringing us in. Sessions also being co-hosted by the Manitoba Association of Parent Councils. Naomi Cruz, the executive director, is here, and I'll be calling her up in a couple minutes. But it's a pleasure to welcome you here. A couple housekeeping items. There's coffee and snacks in the room as you came in. People who know Frontier know they never have to bring breakfast when they come here because we will always endeavor to feed you well. It's something that we do. We have a lot of people coming through here. Washrooms are down the hall. Both hallways, as you go out, there's washrooms, and there's also washrooms upstairs if you need, or you can run downstairs and follow the hallway, and you'll find some more washrooms. We just asking that you, with your coffee cups, that you use them more than once. I think we bought some that should last more than one cup, just to cut down on the waste. The event is being streamed to Cranberry Portage. I want to thank our technology department, who have been very diligent in getting us set up, and actually we have probably some of the best capacity in the province to host events such as this and broadcast them to numerous locations. I can think back to when we first started, and the quality now versus some of the distance events that I've attended is immeasurably better, and I know that you've been working diligently on that. Before I get into any formal introductions and comments, I'd like to ask Bradley, he's our head of technology, to make a few remarks on etiquette.
Good morning, everyone. Again, welcome. It's always been a privilege and actually a challenge, but now it's more privilege than challenge to take part in hosting this event. Just a couple of things really quickly. There for the speakers in this room specific and in each room, you or presenters, you will be told where your camera zone is. Step outside that zone, you're off the camera. All of your presentations will actually be done directly, so it's not a big concern when your PowerPoint is up. If it's being done directly, you're off camera. For those that are viewing, if you didn't get a chance to ask a question and you wanted to, the sessions are all being recorded and will be available online through MERN's website. The questions are also recorded that are texted to the presenter. So if they did answer it and you didn't get a chance to hear it, or you didn't get a chance to be there, you had to step away, please go back to that site at a later date and review the videos, and you'll probably find that what you were interested in was either addressed or dealt with. I think that is pretty much it. In terms of etiquette, the main keynote speaker this morning, the video conferencing, this will be the only active microphone or active site. The remote site, your mic will be muted. So if we see lips moving, that's all you're going to get. We do that so it's less disruptive, and it's always fun to play with the people at the other end. I think that's basically it from our camp. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradley. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Kathy Fedorchuk in Cranberry Portage. Kathy is superintendent for Area 4 in our division, and for those of you not familiar with our division, if you look at the great big map over there, you'll see where Area 4 is up in the Cranberry Portage region. So we're really happy that Kathy and some of her staff are joining us and actually presenting from up there and broadcasting back to us. So Kathy, I'll turn it over to you for a moment.
Good morning, and I'd like to welcome everybody that's down in Winnipeg, beamed in to the north. It's a beautiful day up here in the north. We have 3 sessions that are going to be broadcast from our location, and I challenge you to join those sessions. We've got some exciting topics to be talking about, and I would say that this opportunity to do grassroots education in this way, where we can all get together in more of a remote way, but we can still all get together and share knowledge with each other, I think is very important. And I'm proud Frontier School Division is able to provide the capacity to one of the things we always try to do. So good morning.
Good morning, and thank you. As I mentioned earlier, the forum is being co-hosted by the Manitoba Association of Parent Council. And Naomi, you want to give everybody a wave? Where is Naomi sitting? All right, there's Naomi. I've often been embarrassed with Naomi because I see her in different contexts and wearing different clothes, and I don't recognize her. And but now I think I've got it down. Yeah, I think I've got it down now, Naomi. But Naomi has become a real familiar and regular presence at a lot of educational events, and she keeps us mindful of the critical role that parents hold in our system. The theme of our forum is grassroots engagement. And while this may mean a number of things to other people, when I think about grassroots engagement, I'm thinking about the involvement and the engagement of parents in the system and the broader community in the system. Within our division, we've adopted a motto, a concept, and we talk a lot now about supporting children and their families from cradle to career. We no longer really talk about our responsibility starting at age 5 or 6 or regular school age. Our responsibility starts probably prior to birth. For our division, engaging parents from the time their child is born is critical to positive outcomes for children in school. The recent EDI stats and the divisional dial assessments underline the fact that the achievement gap that we talk about in all our literature and we talk about in our documents that we make public, the achievement gap between many of our children as compared to the rest of the province starts at conception. It's hard to imagine, I was pondering this last night and the last couple of days, but it's hard to imagine that at the moment of birth, at the moment a baby is born, they're immediately starting to fall behind their provincial cohort in many of our communities. Therefore, if we have a serious commitment to closing the achievement gap, our division must adopt an approach that embraces and engages children and their families from cradle to career. And I'm really happy that Dr. Santos is here, and we've had him speak to our board and to our division a number of times on this topic, so I was very happy to see you delivering the keynote. A few days ago, I was sitting in a circle in a band hall in Grand Rapids, and many of the people in the circle shared their vision for education in the community. Circle included participants who were elders, young parents, community leaders, students who had dropped out of school, among many others. My tendency in these situations is to jump to solutions that can be brought to bear, programs we can bring in, the great things that Frontier has to offer. And it's very hard not to do this because for the most part, myself and the staff in Frontier, staff around me, are wired for action, for decisions, for pushing forward. But by jumping in with many of our programs and jumping in with our solutions, we then have begun the process of shutting down parental and community engagement. As we assert ourselves with our answers and we assert ourselves with our programs, the grassroots people will quietly, gently, but inevitably pull away. With the very best of intentions, I've taken away an opportunity to build, for people to build something that's truly their own. Do we have a responsibility as a division? Do we have a role to play? For sure. But we must not let our approach and our programming, but we have to let our programming and our approach be shaped by the voices of the people. In Frontier, we're governed by school committees. And I like to point out when I talk to lots of my colleagues that while they're electing 10 trustees, we're holding an election for 230 positions. Every school has an elected school committee to provide local governance, local programming, and local decision-making at the community level. This includes hiring staff. and making sure that the educational programs reflect the aspirations of the community. I really believe and I'm committed to our model of governance. But it requires that we as the paid professionals in the system understand that our role is one of service. Our role is one of partnership. It is one of support. And as soon as we in the system move to an attitude of control for the sake of administrative expediency, for the sake of standardization, we lose the engagement of the committee that are governing and the community. Because very quickly they perceive that their involvement is at best superficial. The end result is apathy, and in the result, also in the worst, it would be bitter divides and conflict. But the very foundation of our division, the foundational governance piece of our division, is predicated on engagement by parents and community. And I'd also acknowledge that there's always a tension between the desire and the need of the system to control, direct, and standardize, and the messy processes and time that it takes to have true grassroots engagement. The balance between letting go and still managing the things that need to be managed is not an easy task for those in the system. I could go on at some point on this, but I am not the speaker for today, so I am going to have to just leave it at that. But it's certainly a long and could be a very great discussion in terms of our roles in engagement. But it's now my pleasure to introduce our Deputy Minister of Education, Dr. Gerald Farthing. There are many things I could say about Gerald, but what I would say... no, it's all good. But what I would say within the context of the topic of grassroots engagement is that I believe that Gerald has broken new ground in his commitment to engage with people no matter where they are in our province. While I appreciate technology and we enjoy it, Gerald has made it a priority to be physically present with people. He can be found sitting in a band hall as he was a few days ago in Grand Rapids, or sharing an outdoor breakfast of fried bologna with the community of Norway House. It's the noisy chairs in Kathy's office. I am familiar with those. But anyway, Gerald is present wherever I go and wherever we travel in the province. And as I was saying this last summer, whether it be sharing a breakfast of fried bologna, which actually was surprisingly good. I hadn't had it for a long time, on the lake in Norway House. At times I get a call from places such as Matheson Island, which you would have to look for on our map, letting me know that the Deputy Minister has dropped in for a visit. What I have learned, and what Gerald has long practiced, is that nothing honors people throughout our vast province more than people knowing that you took the time and you made the effort to be among them no matter where they might be. This morning I was listening to the Treaty Commissioner, Jamie Wilson, on CBC, and he was quoting Justice Sinclair, and he said, if you want to move people, and in the case that we're talking about today, to greater engagement, you walk to where they are. You walk to where they are, and you take and lead them by the hand. In the end, that is probably the best thing I can say about our Deputy Minister in introducing him, is that he has and continues to walk among us. Gerald?
Well, thank you very much for that really very warm introduction, and thank you very much, Ray, for those kind words you said about me. I'm actually very, very flattered and appreciative. And it's a pleasure to be here. It's always not only fun, but it's also it's kind of being involved in these kind of things for me is it's like professional development, because you turn your mind to certain things that you perhaps haven't thought about for a long time. And when you're asked to speak in front of people about something, of course, you give that topic more thought than you would have otherwise. I want to begin, though, by saying thank you to Frontier School Division and the Manitoba Association of Parent Councils for hosting yet another important event like this. I want to say thank you to Heather for what she does with MERN and organizing forums like this and doing the other things that MERN does. And I want to say hello to Cranberry Portage and my friends and colleagues in Cranberry Portage. So nice to see you and see you be part of this, and so nice to see that you're actually going to put on, I think 3 sessions you said, Kathy, there. And I haven't been to Cranberry Portage for a while, and I'm anxious to get there and see the finished buildings and visit. And hopefully I'll be doing that soon. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that, so I have some remarks to make, and Heather said I have 15, 20 minutes. I'll keep it to that because we all want to hear from Rob. She left it wide open as to what I would speak about, and I decided to speak about the topic, which of course makes sense. I'm speaking about the topic from a rather narrow perspective because I'm going to speak about it in terms of student engagement, and not just in terms, and not even broadly in that respect, but student engagement and student academic achievement. And so some of what I'm going to say is anticipating what I'm going to say, or knowing what I'm going to say, I should say, is making me a little nervous. And it's making me nervous for a couple of reasons. One is, I'm going to say some things that a lot of us probably don't believe, or might not want to believe. Let's put it that way. Some of what I'm going to say is going to sound counterintuitive, and some of what I'm going to, and I'm going to say some things about engagement, and in particular the relationship between student engagement and student achievement, that may make it sound like I don't think engagement is important, but I do. I think engagement is very important. And I also see engagement in those very broad terms that Ray just talked about. So we could be talking about, in education, engagement from many perspectives, many different perspectives. We could also be talking about engagement with many different people, students, parents, community, colleagues, staff, and so on. And so I want to say right up front, engagement I think is important. All of what Ray said about me in terms of being engaged is true and authentic. And I do try to be like that. I'm not always like that, but I do try to be like that because I like to do things that way. And I find it to be fulfilling to do my work in the way that Ray explained. I'm going to get to the part that, and I'm also a little nervous because of the topic, the way in which the keynote, the way in which the keynote has been introduced in your brochure about how important engagement is and so on. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for Rob Santos, and I know he's a first-class researcher, and I know that he only says things that he believes to be true. And so there's a good possibility that he's going to say some things that are going to perhaps contradict, perhaps undermine what I'm going to be saying or suggesting. Okay, maybe suggesting is the right word. I'm going to be okay with that and comfortable with that because maybe I'm wrong. Or maybe we need to think of things a little different, about this a little differently, or maybe we need to struggle with some research that suggests something other than what we might want to believe. And I know everybody in the room is going to be okay with that because what we want today to be about is a really good, really honest, a collegial conversation about something that is important. And if we do that, we will have done something that matters today, something worthwhile. So first, what do we, and there's a lot of things you can say about engagement, and I could have a long list, but I'm going to start off with a short list, and it's about a few important things I think that we can agree on. A few important things we know and I think we can agree on. First of all, engagement, and I'm talking now about students. I'm not talking about engaging with parents or community members or colleagues or educators or whomever, or trustees or whomever. I'm talking about, which is all important, but I'm talking about students. Now, So we know that engagement goes down in the higher grades. There seems to be, and however we define engagement, and I'll get to that, engagement is way higher, however you define it, in the lower grades, early grades I should say, and then it goes down fairly dramatically in the higher grades, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that. Secondly, the prevalence, and this is another way of talking about engagement, is to talk about being disengaged, and this is the way the OECD talks about it. The prevalence of disaffected students varies among schools in all OECD countries. So it's not, the situation is the same everywhere. The OECD report, there's an OECD report from 2010 that shows that there's a lot of variation between schools, and I would imagine within schools, in every OECD country. So we can't talk about this as being the same everywhere when we talk about engagement. And another thing the same study shows is that engagement is lower for students, however you define it, however you talk about it, is lower for students in for those students in lower socioeconomic circumstances. And I think that's really important. If we're going to have a very nuanced and deep understanding of what engagement means and what it means in terms of students and in terms of students' achievement, we have to know and understand these things as best we can. Having said all that, we also have to be mindful, as I've already indicated, that engagement is very multidimensional. There are many different ways to look at engagement, and let me just give you a few. The Canadian Education Association, which has done a tremendous amount of work around engagement in Canada, with the what did you do in school today, tell them from me, and so on. A lot of work, and if you go to the website, you'll see a lot of reports. Talks about social engagement, intellectual engagement, and academic engagement. So they talk about engagement from those three perspectives, and bless their dear hearts, they define what they mean by intellectual, academic, and social. The OECD, on the other hand, seems to talk about engagement in a more sort of way we would normally talk about it, I guess, street-level way. They talk about belonging and participation. So the OECD talks very much about engagement from that perspective, whether a student feels like they belong in the school and whether they're participating in the school in some way. If you look at our grade 7, we have a fairly long list of dimensions or factors, including interest in learning, engages in self-assessment, awareness of learning goals, participates in lessons, accepts responsibility for assignments. So you can see that different people talk about, characterize engagement in different ways, all of them which I think are legitimate, but we have to be careful to know which perspective we're coming from when we're talking about this, just like we have to be careful about who we're talking about when we talk about engagement in education. So after looking at all that, I went to the best source well, maybe not the best, maybe one should never say that, but a very good source, or one that I rely on, which is the Oxford English Dictionary. And I looked up engagement, and, there's a number of definitions, right? A, B, C, D, or whatever it is. But what seemed to be most pertinent here, and what I latched on, was engagement means involvement. So then I decided, well, I'll look up involvement. What does involvement mean? I know I'm not going down the rabbit hole, but anyways. I looked up involvement, tempting as that is sometimes. And involvement means, and again, a number of definitions for involvement, but what I picked on and what seems to be front and center when you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and you look up involvement, participation. So engagement means being involved, which in turn means participating. And that seems to be, that pathway makes sense for me. So let me talk about the troubling part. And as I indicated earlier, we've been measuring engagement in grade 7 for 4 years now, and if you go and look at what the results are, you'll see that engagement has changed very little over those 4 years. It's gone up slightly in our province, as measured in the way we measure it in grade 7, and so that's what's happened in the last 4 years. So let me get to the troubling part. I better hurry. I was in Iceland a number of years ago, and it was when, I think it must have been the second PISA report. And I'm in an office, and I'm talking with officials from Iceland about PISA. And of course, Finland was at the top again. And we're all wondering what's going on in Finland. Why is it that Finland is doing so well? Because they just sort of burst onto the onto the scene, and Pasi Sahlberg hadn't written his book yet, Finnish Times, or no, Finnish Education, and so on. And so I'm in Iceland, so I asked them, you know, and then I, you know, and they don't really know, and then I suggest to them that there must be a high level of engagement. The students must be really motivated, really involved in their education. And I was shocked, because what they said to me, no, actually, there's low levels of engagement in Finland. I said, no, can't be. That can't be. Yeah, they said, they didn't have the research in front of them, but they said, when we know a little bit about Finland, there are, you know, they're not that far away, all part of Europe, all, you know, so on. They said the engagement is not high in Finland. And I left surprised and bewildered. I said, how can this be? Because in my mind, there's a direct, solid line connection between engagement and student achievement. And here we got Finland at the top of the PISA scores, and I'm being told this, so I'm thinking, that it can't be right. So I checked it out. I asked some people from Finland about that, and they confirmed it. And I checked it out again recently when Pasi Sahlberg was in Elkhorn Resort doing a presentation, and I asked him, and he said, that's right. There are not, when they measure engagement in Finland, student engagement, it is not particularly high. In fact, it's kind of low. Not real low, but relatively low. And I've been thinking about that ever since the conversation in Iceland. What does this mean? How should we now think about student engagement and student achievement and the connection between the two if this is indeed the case? So in preparation for this, I did a little more research. And if you go to a document, and you can go online, of course, and get it, called Student Engagement at School, A Sense of Belonging and Participation, Results from PISA 2000, written by John Douglas Wilms, he says this: small classroom and school-based studies have found that the correlation between academic achievement and engagement is moderate. Page 10, if you want to go straight there. If you want to Google it and go, you know, page 10. He says that. The CEA, the Canadian Education Association, if you go and look at a document called the First National Report on what did you do in school today, if you go and look at that report, that First National Report, page 31, it says, and they're talking about Canada, okay, the CEA is reporting about this in Canada, and we all know how much this work the CEA has done in this area over the last number of years, and the emphasis, and it's been good work, but they say, and I'm quoting, high student achievement is not matched by high levels of achievement. Page 31. That's a quote. Okay? If we go back to the Wilms report and we go to the very last paragraph, I've got the whole last paragraph here, but I don't have time and I don't want to bore you too much, so I'm not going to read the whole last paragraph. I'm just going to read the first half of the last paragraph in that report. And this is, and I'm reading verbatim. Taken together, these findings do not lend support to the popular belief that efforts to increase student engagement will result in large gains in literacy skills. This may be the case for a small proportion of students who are regularly absent from school and are performing slightly below norms in their academic work. Rather, the findings indicate that there are many students who are disaffected from school who are doing well academically and vice versa. I frankly don't know what to make of that. I'm trying to sort it out, and so I'm going to end by telling you where I am at the moment, which is not a very clear or defined place. Okay? Not too many of you are surprised by that, right? Okay, so this is what I suspect. It's not what I know. It's not what I've concluded. I'm quite a ways away from being there, but this is what I suspect. Engagement doesn't matter as much as we think for most students. Okay? Engagement matters, but not as much as we think for most students. But it matters more than we think for some students. Students who are struggling, students who are at risk, students who have been marginalized and disaffected in some way. Engagement matters a lot for those students. A lot. But it matters much less than we'd like to think, and this is counterintuitive, I know, because we all know how important relationships are. in all aspects of our lives. We know that. Okay? So it seems counterintuitive, but it matters less for most of the students than we think. Not that it doesn't matter at all, but it matters a lot for some students. Therefore, it matters. Engagement is important. We should be talking about engagement. We should be thinking about it. We should be trying to do it. But perhaps what we should be doing is trying to be more focused about it. Talk about it in a more, let me put it this way, targeted way. Maybe our research and our efforts should be more in one place than another place. And maybe rather than being broad and not too deep, maybe our efforts should be narrower and very deep. And maybe then we would see a much stronger connection between encouraging engagement and having students be engaged and student achievement. So that's where I am at the moment. I'm dying to hear what Rob's going to say. And I thank you very much for your attention and patience. Merci, Megwitch. Thank you.
Okay.
Guys in Cranberry, you want to move to the stream now, monitoring the stream. We're going to be closing down the video conference portion and going to the stream.
This is the closest I'll ever be to a TV star. I'm just watching for my cue. Yep. Oh, yeah. Our Keynote? Give that to Rob. Better on your
lapel, right? Yeah.
Hey? Just do a
Good morning, Brad.
Good morning, Rob.
Yeah.
How are you this morning?
Pretty good. How's
Good.
the sound?
Okay. I wanted to say thank you to Gerald. I don't know where he's disappeared to, but I know that I'm always excited by the possibilities that exist when we start talking about engagement and when Roy mentioned family engagement. So as I was saying, I'm always excited when the discussion is about the possibilities that exist when there's active family engagement, and I know I'm always inspired when I hear Ray speak to exactly that in Frontier Division. So thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rob Santos, who will be speaking with us today about engagement in, for, and with education. Dr. Santos comes to us with an extraordinary list of credentials. And as a new person to the world of post-secondary education, I know that I'm somewhat humbled and in awe when I started reading the list of accomplishments he's made. A very abbreviated list includes his role as the Associate Secretary to the Province of Manitoba's Healthy Child Committee of Cabinet, which is the only legislated cabinet committee in Canada dedicated to the well-being of children and youth. His role as Executive Director for Science and Policy at Healthy Child Manitoba. He's also represented Manitoba on an extensive list of federal, provincial, and territorial committees dedicated to early childhood development and youth. He's currently co-chair for Manitoba's Oversight Committee for Child and Youth Mental Health. He's cross-appointed as a research scientist at the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy, and as well he's an assistant professor in the Department of Community Health Services for the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Manitoba. And there's a lot more that went beyond that, but I thought we've only got so much time. So I ask you now to please join me now in welcoming Dr. Santos as we learn more about engagement and how it supports children, youth, parents, and families in the communities.
Thank you, Naomi, and Gerald, and Ray, and Heather, and everybody for the invitation to come speak. Just looking for, put this up here. Andrew, do you do this, or do I turn it on?
Check the output on it, because it's still blank screen set up here.
Okay, I'll just do a flip.
Well, you've done this before. That's correct. See what happens. Looks positive. Be nice if you could see yours too, though, right?
One more time.
Either
One
one
more
would be fine. There we go.
You're okay with just that?
I probably could use both screens.
Let's
if
see
it'll
what
let
happens
us.
here. It still sees the inputs. Give it a second.
Oh, impatient.
Yours. Yeah.
There we
Awesome.
go. Thanks, Bradley. So what I love about Ray and why my heart sunk when I saw a certain job posting some time ago, and why I love working with Gerald and others here is, and Gerald actually introduced me to this concept some years ago, the concept of a critical friend. And so I would emphasize friend and certainly mentor and colleague with all the folks here, especially in light of Gerald's introductory comments. What I want to suggest today is actually a perspective on engagement that is actually quite compatible with Ray's introduction, this sort of cradle to career perspective, and might give us some clues for going down the pathway or the rabbit hole or whatever it may be with Gerald and others who are validly perplexed by various findings, including the ones that Gerald has summarized this morning. So when Heather, who is, as you know, somebody who's very difficult to say no to, invited me to come speak about engagement, I thought, oh, narrow, focused topic. Turns out it's quite very broad, as you already know. And so I thought, well, this is really about talking about engagement in education, engagement for education, and engagement with education, in all that manifold way. And as I got into the literature and sort of trying to approach this in a broad way, because knowing of the breadth of presentations and the concurrent sessions, which look fabulous, and I wish I could stay for any or all of them, the get real phrase kept coming up. So that's the subtitle, and you'll see where I'm getting at with that as we go through the presentation. If you've seen me present before, you know I normally foist baby pictures as part of having to come and present, but my babies are no longer babies anymore. They're in grade 3, so there's a more recent photo to get that out of the way. So Aristotle, smart guy, thousands of years ago, talked about educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. That becomes important concept because of the findings relevant to, as Gerald talked about, student achievement, and then learning broadly, and then lifelong learning even more broadly, as Ray introduced it. That both elements is quite essential, and that was something that was known earlier on and verified with lots of confluence of evidence. We'll come back to that. And then American politician William Bennett talked about all real education is the architecture of the soul. And as a scientist, I say the word soul with circumspect. As a human being, I think we can all, as fellow human beings, we can relate to the deeper meaning of that, and also the original meaning, speaking of Oxford English Dictionary of Education, which you all know, I'm sure. It's rooted in the Latin educere, which is really about drawing forth. So it's not about filling empty vessels with knowledge, it's about drawing forth what's already within. And as we'll see with the epigenetic data, there's a real molecular basis as well as a real philosophical basis to this idea that what we are doing is providing contexts, opportunities, environments to draw forth the potential of every young person, every learner across their lives. So as Gerald said, if you Google engagement, you look it up in the dictionary, you see word clouds like this of various meanings and connections and correlations, students, people, work, and that's really the complexity of this topic. And so what I'm going to try to offer is a sort of maybe a general or more all-purpose way of looking at that as food for thought, as one attempt to sort of look at the different literatures, including what Gerald talked about, Doug Williams' work and others, to give us something to continue talking about, to give some clues about where, as Ray said, we have the best bets in terms of optimizing learning for the young people that we serve and the families that we work with. but also addressing the gaps, the challenges, and going deeper where we need to in the way that Gerald and Ray talked about. So when most people who don't talk about engagement in any professional sense hear the word engagement, they probably think about something like this. So when I think Ray talked about holding hands, I mean, this is probably one of the more ultimate forms of taking somebody's hand and walking with them. It occurred to me that whether it's betrothal or engagement, all the various cultural forms of this agreement between, in this case, two people, to walk together for a period of time, maybe their lifetime, there's lots to learn in that particular form of engagement within an educational context. So let me just come back to this in a second. So I want to try to, because we got, I usually talk too long and too fast, so try to focus here. Take home message one, and this comes back to that subtitle of getting real. Engagement must be real. And I'm just going to warn you that, as you already know, whatever you mean by engagement, there's no shortcuts to it. So that's apologies, because I know we're all short of time and energy sometimes, but this is one of the things in life and in learning that takes a bit more. So with that theme of real, let's get real for a moment, and that word becomes important. But before that, just want to credit our education minister yesterday at the announcement. I came across this cartoon. Any math teachers or math folks in the room? So those that might not remember, on the left is the denotation I for imaginary numbers. And then on the right is pi, 3.14 into infinity. The imaginary number is saying to the irrational number, be rational. The irrational number is saying to the imaginary number, get real. So I reference that because math and language are a big focus of Minister Bjornsson's announcement yesterday. I was just talking to Gerald at the outset that graph is remarkable in terms of growth and investment in school funding over the last decade and a half. And then I think Gerald's introductory comments about really needing to focus and go deeper on what matters most for the specific and broader purposes of that funding, the learning of our students, our children, families, in specific areas like literacy and numeracy, and then more broadly, hugely important. And so this getting real idea is key. So getting to the point, what is real engagement? Just a warning sign, that's an acronym. Work in government, academic connections, trained as a clinician. Every one of those groups loves acronyms. So with all due respect and all due apologies, REAL is an acronym that I want to offer here as a kind of an all-purpose way of thinking and talking and maybe working in the area of engagement, whether you're talking about student engagement, parent engagement, community engagement, at different ages, in different settings. I'll get to that. So what is this acronym? If you look at the different literatures, as Gerald outlined it, which was a great cue up around participation and involvement, from different disciplines, different sciences, different knowledge traditions, different cultures for that matter, these are some of the common elements that go into all the meanings of engagement, depending on whether that's within, inside out is one of the Barry's, or Gary's session later on about leadership on the inside out, all the way to engaging at the national level is one of the other sessions I'm going to be talking about. So the R is for relational. I don't think I need to elaborate on that, but that's really about one or more individuals in relationship, and Gerald talked about that perspective on relationships. Ideally, there's a particular kind of relationship there, regardless of whether it's teacher-student, teacher-to-teacher, teacher-to-parent, parent-to-parent, all the combinations in life is reciprocity, that back and forth, that walking together. And so without a relationship, a relationality, as Gerald said, there can be no engagement. And I would extend that to that also is within us, each of us, our relationship with ourselves, our self-perception, the growing self-perception and self-regard we all have growing up from cradle to career. The E is around empathy. Real engagement is empathic. So there's whole literatures on empathy, its development, its different forms between partners, between older and younger, between parent and child, between teacher and student. The core of all of that, as you know, in your own experience and the evidence itself, is this interconnectedness, this resonating. So it's not just that you're aware of, but there's an attunement, and there's interesting neuroscience literature about how neurons actually start mirroring one another. with each other's thoughts and feelings. And that can be extended, but most of the focus on the research on empathy has been about being able to relate to how somebody is thinking about something and seeing things and walking in their shoes and seeing from their perspective, and how they're, more importantly, how they're feeling about it. That starts developing very early in life. So programs like Roots of Empathy, which is focusing on that, are based on that knowledge. The A is for active. So real engagement, I might contrast that with something like consultation, which is often not reciprocal, which is often time limited, which is often not dealing with both thoughts and feelings, and is often a passive kind of thing where maybe people will come and show up and maybe they'll say something and maybe you'll listen. That's an extreme version of it. This is about intentionality and an intentional focus in that interaction, in that relationship where there's empathy, both proactively, the reaching out, but also a reactive or a responsive, so that back and forth. And then lastly, the L, which is probably most important, is this is a long-term deal. So real engagement in whatever form, as you already know, takes time. It's not something that often happens overnight. People have stories probably of meeting their true love instantly or just having an immediate connection with somebody. But if you actually look at studies about those kinds of things, they're actually relatively uncommon. We remember them more because they're prominent. But as you already know, I think real engagement takes time and grows more meaningful over time. And we'll come back to that concept of meaning in a second. So first take-home message is engagement must be real. Second take-home message is our brains and our very being are built through real engagement. And this is where I think, I agree actually with everything Gerald said, despite his worry that it might be controversial, because it's complemented by what we know around the data that Doug has collected, around the data from PISA, around the kind of student engagement data that's collected in Manitoba and other schools across the world. What we know on this, and you've heard the early childhood development presentation, so I think that'll be a refresh. It's essential for effective learning and living all the way, as Ray said, from before birth through adulthood. So what's causing this to happen? So a quarter century ago, William Greenough published a kind of a breakthrough paper in the journal Child Development called Experience and Brain Development. And that was where the concepts of experience expectant development and experience dependent development was first sort of coined. Around that time, in the mid-'80s, people were still talking about critical periods of development, this sort of use it or lose it period, and then after which things were kind of closed off. What this added to that literature and the dialogue and the debate was that if you look at human development writ large, and actually across species, not just human beings, but other living beings on the planet, there seem to be two kinds of ways that development occurs, both depending on engagement. One was experience expectant, which are the things that are most common in most people's environments. So, for example, the development of vision and hearing, most living beings have those faculties. And then there's the more, and this is where culture often comes into play more strongly, experience dependent are the unique features of an individual life or an individual community or individual society. Language, cultural beliefs and practices. And the combination of those, they're not at odds, they actually operate together, are what shape the development of our brains and our being over the life course, from early childhood, and then, can't see on here, but that goes all the way through middle childhood, adolescent development, adult development. So this is a helpful concept because it can be all-purpose across the lifespan. I think you know Jim Heckman's work. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2000. He's argued strongly for what, actually this is not his term, but people like Jamie Wilson have talked about this as this idea of a compound interest model of brain development, with the idea that because human brain development is cumulative, skill begets skill, foundations are built stronger or not, and then later learning depends on earlier learning, as you already know as educators. You already know, and Ray talked about this already, that most of that is optimized in the earlier years, like a bank account, like an RRSP, where earlier investment, longer time to grow and accumulate over time, compound and multiply over time, the stronger that can be. Which is why the economic argument for earlier investment from pre-birth, even if you're focusing only on school outcomes, is something that the province has really rallied around, as you know, over the last decade and a half and more. So I think you already know the landmark book from 2000, From Neurons to Neighborhoods. That is the answer in the syllabus around how does engagement do this. The answer from what we know from the different sciences is that this engagement is happening at the neuronal level with this broad idea, as neurons connect, all the way to neighborhoods. And Jim and Sean is going to be talking about Merchant's Corner. I mean, this is what's going on, shaping human development from pre-birth onwards, setting that stage, sturdier, fragile in the early years. Hopefully everybody's seen by now. I won't show the videos, but you can click this link if you get later. Harvard Center's on the Developing Child has talked about these core concepts of early childhood development of ECD. So the first is experiences, and as you'll see, the key experience there is engagement, builds the architecture of the brain right from the beginning. From the bottom up, like a house, the sensory faculties, seeing and hearing, early language, and then executive function. Second core concept is there's a particular kind of experience that researchers have called serve and return, a back and forth, like ping pong or tennis or any back and forth kind of sport. I usually pause here and ask for recognition at the hours I spent on the internet looking for a photo of a baby with a tennis racket. Thank you. Thank you very much. They're surprisingly rare. And then somebody later told me that they think that's actually a mosquito zapper, so I failed again. That serve and return back and forth interaction. So imagine a parent with their baby and the cooing and the responding is shaping the circuitry of the brain right from the beginning. It's actually happening in the womb, which is why that preconceptual view that Ray talked about is hugely important. So coming back to this idea from William Bennett, engagement, that serve and return interaction, the engagement of caregivers and children, shaping the developing brain, building the architecture of the brain, ultimately as the earliest form of education, shaping the architecture of that child's being, the soul in its original meaning of the term. As well, it's not just about cognitive development, it's also about emotional development. So back to Aristotle's age-old view on educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. That's even more relevant when you look at the neurobiology of the third core concept, which is toxic stress. So there's different kinds of stress, as you know. There's the stress of following a chief superintendent and a deputy minister in the speaking order, them covering all your topics already, and it's a little stressful. That's fine. You learn, you respond. This is the kind of stress that makes you stronger, and you learn from. As you already know in the work that you do, particularly our colleagues in Frontier School Division, there's a more pernicious, pervasive form of stress that's chronic, that's actually toxic to healthy human development. And the reason that's relevant for the heart and mind concept, comment, or quote, is that this kind of toxic stress, think about chronic unchangeable poverty, maltreatment, violence, addictions surrounding the developing child, are fueling or activating the stress response hormones and pathways in like cortisol, for example, bathing the whole body, all of its systems, brain and body, and all of the being with stress, and the response to that, fight or flight, without any relief. What it's doing is preparing the developing brain and body, the developing child, for that kind of world. And so right from the beginning, like Ray said, from preconception, we're sending signals, messages to the developing child of what the world will be like out there. Will it be protective, caring, nurturing, nutritious, predictable, consistent, all those things that we need across our lives, actually? Or will it be other ways? Will it be predatory? Will it be unpredictable, chaotic, harmful? That's sending signals to the developing body and brain to prepare for the world in which that baby's born, for better or for worse. And much of what we see in the way of the misery statistics, the troubling things that Gerald referenced in his opening comments and Ray did as well, stem in a large part to what's happening, as you already know, before kids start school. So just one example of a huge literature now on poverty as one major toxic stressor in early childhood. Joan Luby published the first study a little over a year and a half ago now, looking at the impacts of poverty, growing up in poverty, and the developing structures of the brain. She finds that it's associated with smaller white matter. That's the myelinated sheaths, the fatty covered neurons for rapid transmission in the brain. Cortical gray matter is less. And then key for schools and education and learning writ large, hippocampal, which is learning and memory, remembering and learning, the sides of your head here, that looks like a tongue on the side there. And the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain, so regulating feelings and outlook, are also reduced when you look at MRI studies of those children. That's mediated by life stress. The good news is a particular kind of engagement, the engagement that serve and return between caregiver and child, protects that developing brain. And so when we talk about optimizing early learning and actually learning through the school years, it's not just about providing optimal learning opportunities, it's also about protecting the brain against toxic stressors. And as you already know, and Gerald has worked harder than anybody I know in focusing on this with people like Helen and others, that looking at children in those circumstances, low-income communities, and other socioeconomic disadvantage, hugely important, as you know, for educational policy and practice. But that's good news, because despite the longer-term battle against reducing or eliminating poverty and other toxic stress in the lives of everybody, we can do something immediately, which is to provide that kind of, as I've described it, this kind of engagement that can protect that brain against those toxic stressors. So I want to bridge this now to the epigenetics literature, keeping this concept of real engagement in mind. I think you already know, if you've seen, or we've had discussions before, that there's been breakthroughs in the last decade and a half understanding how our DNA operate. In the 1990s, the decade of the brain, the world was all preoccupied with mapping the human genome. They believed the human blueprint, once outlined on paper, would give us solutions to everything. Turns out the DNA part of the story is only a fraction of that. Turns out that the environment is essential for the expression of the DNA, of the turning on and off of genes, like a light switch in the picture. This is important because it ties back to that original meaning of the word education in the Latin, which is about drawing forth from the individual, the learner. It turns out that there's a molecular, a neurodevelopmental basis for a value or a philosophy that many, if not most people, hold, which is that every person has potential in them, given the right conditions that can be expressed and developed. This is appearing to be the mechanism by which potential is produced. So if we all have human potential in the DNA we inherit from our lineage, our ancestors, our family, the environment in which we rear our children from preconception all the way through adulthood is shaping the expression, the turning on off of the genes, for better or for worse, because it's sending those signals for what kind of world does that developing child need to be prepared to live in. And as Gerald and others already talked about this morning, we need to think as much about those conditions, often outside the classroom or outside the school, as you've all been working on, I know, in your work so far, as we do inside the classroom. This is important also not just for the current generation, but for future generations, because of what we know about the epigenetic intergenerational patterns. So we're not just talking about the expression of the DNA of the parent or the unborn or born child. This is also affecting the reproductive cells of that unborn or born child for their offspring, for their children, a third generation downstream. And this is starting to give some additional understanding for why some cycles and patterns seem to continue through families, through generations, through communities. So this engagement, as I've framed it generally, or lack thereof, seems to be operating through these epigenetic effects. So what's not on the screen, for some reason, the bottom part is really the key question we should keep asking, which is, what epigenetic messages are we sending our children across their lives? And that's messages in what we say, what we do, the kinds of environments we create or fail to create around them as they're growing up. Indigenous researchers like Amy Bombay, who did her postdoc in neuropsychology at Carleton, has written about linking intergenerational trauma, colonization, the residential schools history of the country, to these likely epigenetic mechanisms as one additional explanation for why we seem to see issues and challenges continue across children, grandchildren, down into the future. There's a reason why Justice Murray Sinclair, who chairs the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, in his interim report, Recommendation 8 is all about this. It's all about early childhood development and parenting and redressing those toxic stress experiences in the history of Indigenous peoples in the country. And increasing nurturing environments, serve and return, secure attachment, and decreasing toxic stress. Similar sentiments based on a summary of the latest evidence from the Royal Society Expert Panel on Early Childhood, released the same time in November of 2012. So given what Justice Sinclair has written about, given what leading the child development expert has written about, I'll take that further from the broader literature to say a third take-home message: engagement must be real. Engagement is essential for building brain and being, is that real engagement is actually a human right. If you look at the elements of participation, of belonging, as Gerald outlined it, those are framed in most human rights statements or legislation, certainly at the UN, and more importantly for children. So engagement as a child's human right, Article 12 of the UN Convention, state parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child. The views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. And so that engaging the child, even as young in some countries as 7 or 8 or 6 or 5, depending on their capability and capacity, which in turn is related to the kinds of opportunities and environments that have been created for them in the first place in their developing lives, enshrined in the UN Convention. So if you see me present before, you know I love Eleanor Roosevelt. Her quote here speaks to this in a very deep way. She says, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." So the reason I extend the discussion to these broad sense of universal human rights and rights of children is that, A, they're deeply entrenched in values that most countries and individuals hold for all people, but they can also be traced back, as I've tried to do really quickly, to some really compelling evidence about how we and those and other people over human history have developed, especially in terms of early brain development. This is a book worth reading that just published a few months ago. Anne Maston, if you know the resilience literature, she's kind of the queen of resilience research after Emmy Werner, who I guess is the grand dame. So Anne at University of Minnesota has synthesized the last 50 years of resilience research in a book called Ordinary Magic. That's actually the title of a journal paper she published in 2001. If you don't have time to read the book, here's the summary, page 295. I don't know how Gerald remembered all the page numbers. It's amazing. So if we're going to build resilience, which is the capacity of individuals and whole communities, whole nations, to overcome adversity, to develop competence, good outcomes, despite the odds, it's about nurturing, protecting, and restoring fundamental adaptive systems within individuals and also means across systems like education. The quote here: "Children need water, food, shelter, safety, and medical care, basic human rights or public service entitlements. But they also need attachment security, family, opportunities to play and learn, and a meaningful place in society." And those aren't expressions of values. Those are synthesis statements based on 5 decades of studying children living in diversity and disadvantage, and how did they overcome those disadvantages and adversities to develop good outcomes, to develop competence. So in that, we see both human rights and clues about areas of focus that tie back to this more general purpose definition of engagement that might be useful, hopefully, for your classroom, your community, your work, and even in your own life. So engagement needs to be real, builds the brain and being, tied to human rights. The fourth and last take-home message, as you take it home here, is that there's a particular area of early development that is rising in prominence and its importance. Many of you already knew this, I think, in your own work. That's integral to successful educational and achievement outcomes, which is something called executive function, or EF, which I'll talk about a bit more here. So this is tied again to that developing brain. This applies in early childhood as well as in teenage development. Goes into early adulthood or emerging adulthood, as John Arnett talks about it in this new phase between teenagehood and adulthood. The teenage brain at puberty, second most important period of investment. As you already know, remembering your teenage years, if you work with teenagers, a few things happen to most teenagers at that time in life. Things that they used to find really exciting and scintillating, not so much anymore. They're bored. Reward sensitivity plummets. Partly because of that, but partly because of the changes in the developing brain related to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, really romantic and sexual areas of the brain. Stimulation seeking, risk taking ramps up. And then the focus of attention and consideration gets narrowed from what's going to happen, weeks, months, years from now to right now. This very almost difficult way of not being unable to see past today. This is all related in part to the PFC, or the prefrontal cortex, right behind your eyebrow, right here. That's known as the CEO, or if you like, the deputy minister of the brain. This last comment does not apply to Gerald or any deputy minister, but it's one of the last parts of the brain to mature. You all heard that caveat, right? Gerald also chairs our deputy ministers committee, so. So this is true for the human species since there's been a human species on the planet. There's something about this ordering of development that is important for survival on the planet, for procreation and other things that keep generations going. But think about what this means. So that PFC, as the CEO of the brain, governs decision-making, self-control and self-regulation, including thoughts, feelings, and actions, and planning for the future, and key for learning settings, setting and working towards longer-term goals, even if they're difficult or boring. I'm seeing this already in my kids, where it's like, what's this for? And I'm bored, and it's like, yeah, but this is, you're going to need math. You're going to need that for them. Okay, enough about them. So we need to know developmentally there's a disconnect on average for typically and actually atypically developing children because of the ordering and the progression of typical brain development in the teenager. So one researcher has compared this to having a Lamborghini, a turbocharged car, revving up, and somebody doesn't know how to drive that car. And we all remember that, I think. I remember those days as a teenager, and you work with the teenagers, you already know what this is about. So what is our responsibility as caring adults, educators, caregivers in the lives of children? This concept of scaffolding, which probably comes originally from Vygotsky's frame on education, is the consensus right now in terms of that teenage brain, in terms of our roles and responsibilities. So crucial for this early healthy teenage development, especially the teenage brain, is this idea of social scaffolding, which I had in mind with this concept of real engagement. So for parents, it's warm, structure, age-appropriate autonomy granting as kids get more independent, right balance of monitoring interests from parents, teachers, coaches, other responsible adults, to develop the skills of self-control, of executive function, while still being afforded sufficient support and protection. So the scaffold is an analogy, like when you're building a building, there's a temporary structure to keep that thing solid as you're building the building that can then ultimately stand on its own. I would put a caveat on that, which is we already know personally, and I think there's growing evidence that the temporary nature isn't that when kids get older they don't need us anymore. The temporary part is it's temporal, in that we kind of stay the same as kids keep developing. So they might go into a different classroom. If I'm a grade 5 teacher, they go to grade 6 and grade 7. So we're sort of fixed in place and time as kids move through time and grow up. And so the scaffolding needs to be built across that pathway. And as you already saw with the turbocharged car analogy, when there's a time in life where there's limited executive functioning, limited self-regulatory capacity, and the absence of the scaffolding, weak engagement of the forms listed there, that's the recipe, the equation for vulnerability in youth, and it seems to be the core underlying basis for a variety of things that you're already all familiar with in youth that trouble, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Maybe not the rock and roll part. So Lauren Steinberg, other youth development experts he's from the US at Temple University. Another book worth reading just came out called Age of Opportunity, Lessons from the New Science of Adolescence. So there's a whole chapter 8 called Reimagining High School. So those of you that focus on the high school years. He talks extensively about scaffolding, sustained scaffolded stimulation. So as different, quote, as these kinds of exercises are, their success requires 3 common principles. It must be stimulating, scaffolded, and sustained over time, more than mere repetition structured to improve performance, slow methodical purpose. This is about the outcomes Gerald talked about. This is as relevant to reading and math as it is to the other courses in the curriculum. Adele Diamond, neuroscientist from UBC, I'll quote her in some recent paper she's published talking about improving executive functioning is about improving education. Executive functions are critical for success in school, on the job, and in life. EFs suffer if you're lonely, sad, depressed, or not physically fit. Therefore, if we care about academic outcomes, we should care that students feel they're in a supportive community they can count on, that they're happy, even joyful, and that their bodies are strong and healthy. A school curriculum that ignores children's emotional, social, or physical needs is likely to find that those unmet needs will work against achieving the academic goals. There's Aristotle again. And that's from a paper. The subtitle, well, that's called Want to Optimize Executive Functions and Academic Outcomes, and then the key subtitle, Simply Just Nourish the Human Spirit. And then in other papers, including in Science, one of the top journals in the world, she summarizes from the small but growing literature on things that appear to improve executive functioning in children ages 6 and up. The best executive functioning approaches, and there's a whole array of them, do at least 5 things. The first, engagement, engaging the passionate interests of the learner, and joy and pride of young people. And then other things that either stand in the way of that, like stress, so teaching stress reduction, vigorous physical exercise because of how the brain learns, sense of belonging, which is that Gerald referenced earlier in addition to involvement, and then repeated progressive practices Lawrence Steinberg talked about. When you look at those words, they start sounding like other frameworks that you're all familiar with or someone or others have worked in. Dr. Martin Brokenleg's been to Manitoba many times. Many of you have worked with him. He talks about the circle of courage model, belonging, mastery, independence, generosity. Again, based on universal values and evidence, the combination of which, science and wisdom, trusted knowledge to build resilience. Keep those in mind because in one of the earlier MERN monographs, The Lost Prizes, Ken talks about from the non-Indigenous or less universal literatures, belonging is really about attachment, mastery is about achievement, independence is about autonomy, generosity is about altruism, the 4 A's. Huge social science and developmental literatures on each of those as well that are relevant for our discussion. And then it occurred to me that the 4 areas that Heather drafted out when she said, well, here's what you should talk about, meaningfulness, competence, choice, progress, map on those concepts. So attachment is the sine qua non of producing meaning because in the absence of relationships, frankly, we know from the literature there is no meaning in one's life. Competence is clearly related to achievement and mastery. Choice and autonomy, they usually do choice then competence in the ordering. And then progress, which from these 2 guys, this is Ken Thomas and Walter Timon. This is not in the case of students, but in the workplace of people like you that work in places and understanding what engagement's about and what's intrinsically rewarding in order to achieve empowerment through these kinds of principles. So I offer that only because as Gerald said, there's an array of definitions and measurements of engagement. There's an even broader array of theories underlying it, and then there's an even greater interconnection of literatures in all these areas that are relevant to some degree. We have to make sense of that somehow together and then bring that more locally into practice because there simply isn't time to be able to look at it all. The From Neurons to Neighborhoods work came back 10 years later after the Blue Ribbon panel formed to synthesize the state of the evidence on early child development. And they say even 10 years after the publication of that book, important questions remain. And they're all about engagement. This is the gap in the literature. How can science be used to bring parents, policymakers, and other players together in a coordinated way? So Naoma's work with MAPSI, all of the school's efforts in engaging parents in schools, community schools, and the legislation, all based on those principles, are synonymous with where the cutting edge of the evidence and all the sciences on this front about human learning and development are right now. So we're in the same place together. It's a good place to be because we can learn and act together. So to come to a close here, the idea of a Via Regia, which is actually the royal highway through Europe, but others have talked about the royal road. And so what I want to offer is that this way of thinking about it, which is admittedly quite general and all-purpose, might be a way of sort of synthesizing some of what look kind of odd. And so to come back to Gerald's example, we might understand better why it is that there might be a more of a deepening or a focusing on particular groups of students at a particular time in their development. I think in middle childhood is when most of this is measured. That isn't accounted for in the measures because they had occurred decades earlier. And so we can already tie back the roots of disengagement in that very targeted way to the kinds of toxic stressors that too many children face in Manitoba and across the world. Just one example. So I'll stop there. Catchy phrase, time to get real. And then I'll just close by thanking all of you. And then my mom, who's the first and best to teach me about engagement. That's me. Not even 1 year old yet. thank you for today, and I wish you a great forum and continued conversation.